Chapter 17. Candy waited patiently while the elevator carried her up to Rich's penthouse. She felt pretty optimistic since he'd agreed to see her. As long as he would see her, there was always hope. The doors opened and Rich stood there looking at her, showing no expression at all. She couldn't decide if he was glad to see her or not. "Hi," was all she could come up with to say. Amazing. She'd gone over it 1,000 times, but now that she was standing face to face with him, she couldn't think of a damned thing to say. "Hello, Candy. Would you like to come in?" His demeanor didn't match the friendly words coming from his mouth. "Sure." Nervously, she moved past him. "There's something I need to get straight with you." She took a seat on the couch and waited for him to join her. "I thought everything was straight between us." He sat, but not on the couch. He'd taken the chair across from her, out of her reach. "In your book, maybe, but not mine." "All right," he said with bitter indifference. "So let's set the record straight, and then we can carry on." He wasn't going to make it easy for Candy. Who would have thought, the way he chased her all those years ago, that she'd have to make such an effort to get to him now? But Rich didn't want to be gotten. Not anymore. No, those days were long gone and far away. He'd already spent way too many nights brooding over Candy Simon, wondering what had happened to her, if she was all right. He refused to let that happen anymore. He'd finally managed to tuck her away, safely into the deepest corners of his heart. That's where he intended to keep her. He made himself a promise a long time ago. Candy Simon would never be his problem again. "I was wrong," she said. "It's too late, Candy." His words came with a solemn finality about them. "It's time for you to accept it and get on with your life." "Damn it, Rich." She nearly choked on the tears crowding her throat. "I've tried, but it's just not working." "You've got to make it work. For your own sake." He hesitated. Then irritation seemed to cast a shadow over his already dark eyes. "I don't love you anymore." "How is it that it's so easy for you to say that?" Her voice cracked. "I loved you once, but I learned over the years how to live without you. And truthfully, now I prefer it that way." At least he felt safer. If he didn't let her back in, she couldn't hurt him. "Living without me is better than living with me." "I've lived without you for so long that living with you just doesn't seem that important anymore." His harsh words pierced her heart. Overwhelmed with a deep need to cry, she grabbed her purse and bolted for the door. "Candy." He didn't want to hurt her. He only wanted her to understand. "Candy, wait." He ran after her. The elevator doors closed between them. The image of Candy standing in the elevator with tears spilling down her cheeks stuck in his mind. He went to the service elevator. Maybe he could catch her in the lobby or the garage. He didn't want it to end this way. He wasn't sure how it should end, just not this way. By the time Rich made it into the garage, Candy's Porsche was squealing out of the exit. "Candy!" He called to her, fully aware that she wouldn't hear him. "Please wait!" At first thought, he wanted to get in his car and go after her. But maybe that wasn't the best idea. Maybe it was better this way. Just to let her go. Sure, she'd cry for a while, but then she'd see just how ridiculous this whole thing between them had been in the first place. Yes. It was much better this way. Sure, it had ended a little rough, but it was done. And for good this time. And that had been his main objective all along. So why do I feel like such an asshole? He just couldn't shake the image of Candy standing in the elevator, crying. Cruising onto the freeway, Candy had finally managed to subdue the tears. Traveling recklessly from lane to lane, she kept her foot pressed firmly against the gas pedal. Tears brimmed her eyes again. She wanted to go fast. Faster. The faster she drove, the faster her troubles would disappear. The speedometer hit 90, and she paid no mind to the silent tears trickling from her eyes. The tears slid down her cheeks as the speed hit 100. She wanted to go faster. Faster. Topping 120, she reached up to swipe away the tears. He'd rejected her again. Go faster. But this time his rejection was final. She could tell. And her tears fell harder. 135 and Candy finally cracked. Her silent tears turned audible and poured so hard it was like she was looking through a misty haze. Her body jerked as she cried. Then the car hit something. A quick jolt riveted through Candy and the side of her head hit the window. Pain. Enormous pain. And then a falling sensation. Down, down, down for what seemed an eternity. When she landed, the steering wheel slammed into her chest and the windshield came crashing down around her. Horrific pain ripped through her chest. It was hard to breathe now. Her face felt wet and strange. She wanted to move to get more comfortable. Maybe if she could just sit up. Candy slipped into oblivion. Roxanne paced the length of the living room, unable to shake the dreadful sensation that something was wrong. Terribly wrong. She didn't have any idea what, though. A quick chill breezed through her as she tried to evict the bad feeling. The telephone's ring came as no surprise to her, although it did scare her. She didn't want to answer it, knowing the caller had no news she wanted to hear. Even though her heart screamed, "Don't answer it," her brain commanded her to pick up the receiver. "Hello?" Her voice cracked, weaker than she expected. Just as Roxanne had intuited, the call was unwelcomed. She received scarce information, only that Candy had been involved in a single car accident and she'd been transported by ambulance to St. Joseph's Hospital. Candy. Oh, God. Something had happened to Candy. Mechanically, she opened the address book to Rich's name and dialed his phone number. Hearing it ring twice, she urged him to hurry and answer her call. "Hello?" she heard him say. "Rich?" she questioned him, but didn't wait for a reply. "This is Roxanne." "What's up? Are you okay?" "Something terrible has happened. There's been an accident." Her voice, shaky and pathetic, trailed off. Roxanne couldn't control her tears any longer. "Calm down, Roxanne," Rich said. "Tell me what happened." "They said she's at the hospital, but they won't tell me if she's okay." "Okay. Stay calm. Don't go anywhere. I'll be at your house in 10 minutes, he said, and the line went dead. Rich made it to Roxanne's house in record time, and they went straight to the hospital. "Don't worry," he said to Roxanne as he led her through the emergency entrance. "She's going to be okay." But who was he trying to convince? Himself or Roxanne? Candy had to be okay. If not, he'd never forgive himself. They approached the information desk, and Roxanne said, "We're looking for Candace Simon." The nurse flashed them a startled look, but promptly composed herself. "If you'd like to have a seat, someone will be with you as soon as possible." "I don't want to have a seat," Roxanne said. "I want to see my sister. Now." "Calm down, Roxy." Rich led her to a row of nearby chairs. "Let's just have a seat for now. They'll let us know something when they can." "Can't they just tell us if she's alive?" she asked desperately, and the tears emerged. "Why won't they tell us that?" Rich clasped her face in his hands. "Look on the bright side. If Candy has left us, they'd come out and say it. So she must be alive," he promised. "So let's stay calm for her sake, okay?" "Okay." "You stay here," he said, easing out of his chair. "I'll be right back." He didn't look over his shoulder to see if she'd complied. He fished a coin out of his front pocket and dropped it into the slot of a payphone against the wall and dialed a number. When the call was answered, he said, "Hey, it's me. There's been an accident. Candy is in the hospital." He tried to remain calm. "It looks pretty grim, and Roxanne isn't taking it well." When the conversation ended, Rich hung up the phone and went back to Roxanne's side. Sitting, he draped his arm around her shoulder. "She's gonna be okay," he said surely, struggling to maintain control. A woman approached them. "Miss Simon?" Her voice broke into Roxanne's meditation. "My name is Tanya Allen. I'm your sister's doctor." Rich and Roxanne both stood. "Is my sister all right?" "We cannot be certain of the extent of her injuries just yet," she said regretfully. Roxanne's heart pounded. "But she is alive?" she asked with assumption and a hint of relief. "Yes, she is alive. She's unconscious and unresponsive. I can tell you that she has some facial lacerations, a punctured lung, and several broken ribs." She paused hesitantly and finally added, "The next 24 hours will tell the story." "Can we see her?" Rich asked anxiously. "She's being taken to ICU right now. As soon as she's settled, you can see her. One at a time." The doctor gave the usual instructions and ended with, "She may or may not know you're there." Lacerations, a punctured lung, broken ribs. Reality closed in on Rich. This is all my fault. This never would have happened if he'd been the least bit caring. Why didn't he just admit the truth? Take a leap of faith with her. She'd finally proclaimed her love for him, but he was so worried about his feelings getting hurt that he'd turned his back on her. Would she ever forgive him? Could he ever forgive himself? When they reached the door to Candy's hospital room, Rich stopped and looked at Roxanne. "You go first." "You sure?" "Go." Gently, he pushed her forward. Slowly, Roxanne entered Candy's room. The sight of Candy lying in the bed scared her. Bandages covered her eyes, her forehead, the right side of her face, and both hands spanning up to the middle of her forearms. Her left arm was in a sling. Roxanne pulled a chair up to the side of the bed. Looking at Candy, she felt about as helpless as a person could possibly feel. Her best friend in the whole world lay there lifeless, and she couldn't do anything about it. "Candy, it's me, Rocky." She fought with the need to cry. "They say you might not be able to hear me, but I know better. You have to wake up, Candy." She thought that issuing orders would chase away her tears. It didn't work. "You can't leave me and Frankie here all alone. We can't make it without you." Roxanne kept looking at Candy, expecting her to say something. Anything. But nothing. Candy didn't make a sound. She didn't move. "Rich is here," Roxanne said, hoping that'd spark something from her. It didn't. "He's really worried about you. I think you've won the battle." She tried to ward off the tears, but they came anyway. "If you'll just wake up." She scolded herself silently. It couldn't be good for Candy to hear her crying. Roxanne went back out into the hallway where Rich was patiently waiting. "Are you all right?" he asked, torn between the need to go to Candy's side and not wanting to leave Roxanne alone. "You go on in. I'll be fine." She paused, letting her wits strengthen. "Candy needs to hear your voice. She needs to know you're here." Rich's need to see Candy, to make sure for himself that she was all right. won out over his sense of obligation when he looked at Roxanne's helpless expression. He pushed the door open at a snail's pace. Seeing Candy lying there, covered in far more bandages than he'd anticipated, cut into his soul. He hated seeing her like this, and he hated that he couldn't do anything about it. But mostly, he hated himself for doing it to her. He sat down at her side. "Hey, you feeling okay?" he asked, as if she would just wake up and speak to him. But Candy didn't move. She didn't come close to making a sound. "I'm really sorry." He wanted so badly for her to know that. "I let my pride get in the way, and now look what I've done." Still, she didn't move. "It's gonna be okay, though," he said surely. "I'm gonna stay right here with you." Roxanne went to look for the chapel. She needed a place where she could find solace. It was empty. Good. She sat down a few rows from the front. Alone and frightened, the quiet atmosphere still managed to bring her some peace and tranquility. For the moment, anyway. Staring into the flames of the candlelight, she looked for consolation and found the soft, flickering glow warm and soothing. News and details of the accident had taken its toll on Roxanne. Candy had been traveling on the freeway in excess of 135 miles per hour. The car hit the concrete guard railing, crashed through it, and tumbled down several hundred feet to a quiet city street below. Roxanne knelt, folded her hands together, and rested them on the pew in front of her. "God," she prayed silently, "why did this happen to her? She doesn't deserve it." "God," Roxanne said out loud, "she's never done anything to warrant this. It was me. I'm the one to blame for everything." She bowed her head, fighting the tears. "None of this is her fault. The fault is mine, and mine alone. If anyone has to be punished." She paid no mind to her falling tears. "It should be me." Roxanne sucked in a breath. "Please, God, don't make her pay for the things I've done. If you have to find fault with someone, please let it be me. Please. Take me instead." A firm hand gripped Roxanne's shoulder, and her heart leaped into her throat. Was God granting her request? Taking her right there? "Roxy." A voice called out her name, both familiar and frightening, yet somehow it consoled her. Thank God. "Frankie!" Her tears broke free as he pulled her to her feet. "It's okay," he said. "Candy's gonna be okay." Roxanne could almost believe it when he said it. Frank kept one arm draped around her, and with his other hand he took the handkerchief from his jacket and gently dabbed at her tears. She caught a glimpse of a hopeful smile edging the corners of his mouth. If Roxanne could have seen behind his shades, she would have seen the genuine concern in his eyes for Candy. Frank couldn't go through with his plans. Not right now. He'd have to wait. He couldn't bring himself to do anything to hurt Roxanne while Candy was fighting for her life. He never wanted Roxanne to suffer like this. Not because of some tragedy that befell Candy. Frank led Roxanne back to Candy's room. Sadly, there was no change in her condition. The hospital staff suggested that Roxanne go home and get some rest, assuring her that when she returned in the morning, they should have a better picture of Candy's situation. Roxanne didn't want any part of that. She wasn't going anywhere. She intended to stay put because when Candy did wake up, she planned to be there. Frank had different ideas, though. Roxanne was going home to get some rest. He'd see to it even if he had to stay there to make sure of it. Besides, when their son woke up in the morning, he'd want to know where his mother was. and somebody had to tell him about his Aunt Candy. That someone was going to be Roxanne. Frank would see to that. It hadn't been easy, but Frank managed to coax Roxanne into going home. He followed her up the stairs, his confidence growing in the knowledge that she truly needed him. He also knew he couldn't let her down. Not right now. Not while Candy was in dire straits. A notion at the back of his mind that he might need her to need him, just as much as he wanted her to. But he wouldn't let it in. Frank wasn't forgetting how hard the past few years had been. No one, not even Roxanne, could ever understand what losing her had cost him. Letting go was hard, you see. Life without you was painful for me. Frank sat down on the edge of the bed while Roxanne disappeared into the bathroom. Old memories flooded his head. Memories of the two of them, together and in love. He tried to cast them out. They threatened his well-being. Memories cloud my mind of the love we had. Do you ever think of us? And does it make you sad? Roxanne gazed at her reflection in the mirror. She looked like crap. Her face had paled, drained of all energy. A logical outcome with Frank on the other side of the door. He'd made it clear that he intended to stay. And even though she wanted and needed him to be with her, she knew the truth. She knew why he was there. He just wanted the chance to condemn her and punish her a little bit more. When was it ever going to end? Just how long did she have to pay? Roxanne opened the medicine cabinet and retrieved the pills Jerry had given her. Without much forethought, she filled a glass with water and briskly threw a couple of pills from each bottle into her mouth. Gulping down the liquid, she swallowed the tablets easily. Her confidence blossomed. She checked herself in the mirror and smiled. The medicine would provide the courage she needed to deal with Frank. She undressed, grabbed her nightgown off the hook behind the bathroom door, and slipped the soft garment down over her body. Dragging a brush through her hair, she studied her reflection in the mirror. Roxanne wanted to trust Frank, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he had ulterior motives. With a touch of reluctance, she opened the door. Frank tilted his head and peered at Roxanne. The years had been good to her. Her beauty hadn't faded a bit. Stop that. All those lonely nights were hard to face, and I tried so hard to find someone to take your place. Frank had tried many times to find someone just like Roxanne. His efforts always ended up fruitless and futile. No matter how hard he searched for someone to take her place, he couldn't find anyone to fill that empty space inside of him. Each day he prayed someone would come. Somebody just like her. Many had tried to imitate Roxanne, but none had ever succeeded. Actually, Frank had never succeeded. He'd tried to turn them all into Roxanne, and each time he'd failed miserably. Outwardly, he adjusted his sunglasses as he looked at her. Inwardly, he shut the door on all those old feelings of love, trying so hard to make an escape. He turned down the bed covers and then, with a waving gesture, he urged her to climb into bed. Roxanne crawled between the sheets and didn't object as Frank tucked the covers around her. He turned to move away and she grabbed his hand. Frankie. He glanced over his shoulder. I just wanted to say thank you for being here with me. You're welcome. He took a deep breath. When all is said and done, when you need me, I'll always be here for you. Roxanne allowed herself to hope that maybe she'd underestimated Frank. Truth is, his voice echoed sadness. I've always been here for you. You just never believed it. I'm beginning to believe it now. Yet she couldn't help thinking, I know I shouldn't, but I do. Don't worry, he said, and moved closer to her. I'm going to be here as long as you want me to. She wished he would take off his sunglasses. "Could I ask you to do something for me?" "Sure." "Do you think you could just stay here with me? For a while?" She asked through a tone weakened by the fear of rejection. "And hold me? At least until I fall asleep." Without a word, Frank lay down on the edge of the bed and draped his arm around Roxanne. She moved her arm out from under the covers and laced her fingers with his. He could tell when she had fallen asleep, her grip on his hand loosened. With gentle and slow movements, Frank took off his shades and laid them on the nightstand. He snuggled closer to her, telling himself it didn't mean anything. Her hair fell against his face, and the scent of fresh peaches filled his senses, reminding him of such a long time ago. "I need to know that you still care, that you still need the kind of love we share. I'm blinded by your charms. Is it really so bad to want to begin again? Because only in your arms can my broken heart mend." Rich had a cot brought into Candy's room, and after several hours he finally convinced himself to lie down. He almost drifted off to sleep a couple of times, but the thought that she might wake up kept him from dozing off completely. He couldn't manage much more than lying there thinking about what had happened. He dwelled on all the things he could have done, instead of turning his back on her. If she'd wake up, he could explain everything. He could tell her how he really felt. How his silly pride had gotten in the way, that's all. But now a new fear filled his senses, dashing his hopes. What if he never got the chance to tell her how much he truly did love her? That he always had, and he always would. Candy moaned. "Rich?" Her voice was weak. Way too weak. He rushed to her side. "Candy, can you hear me?" Gently, he caressed her arm. "It's me, Rich. I'm here." "Rich?" She mumbled, dazed, trying to open her eyes. She could almost comprehend that something was forcing them to stay shut. "Where am I?" She tried to move. Awful pain shot through her chest. She winced. "Take it easy. Don't try to move," he said persuasively and laid on the nurse's call button. "You're in the hospital. You had a little accident." "What's wrong?" She could almost grasp the reality that bandages were covering her face, but she was too tired to wonder or care. "Why can't I open my eyes?" The door opened and a nurse came in. Rich felt a measure of relief. "She's talking to me." "Coherently?" The nurse's tone was skeptical. "Well, we're carrying on a conversation," he said. "That's about as coherent as you can get." "Miss Simon." The nurse picked up Candy's wrist to check her pulse. "Can you hear me?" "Yes," Candy said, weak and extremely tired. "Do you know who you are?" The nurse started the usual round of questions. "Candy. My name is Candy." "Candy, do you know where you are?" "No." But she wanted to know what happened, and why Rich was here. That nasty scenario had already played out. When? She couldn't think anymore. So tired. Maybe it's all a dream. So hard to think. Scrambled thoughts drifted through her consciousness until it finally faded away. The next morning, Frank prepared a breakfast tray for Roxanne. He plucked a rose from the bouquet on the table and laid it next to the plate. Little Frankie followed him upstairs. "What's that for?" "We're going to take this up to Mommy so she can have breakfast in bed." "Are you going to stay with us now, Daddy?" "For a while." Frank didn't want to push the subject just yet. "Let's be very quiet when we go in," he said, standing at Roxanne's bedroom door. "And we'll have some fun waking up Mommy." Little Frankie opened the door, and it pleased Frank to see that Roxanne was still asleep. He set the tray on the nightstand and stalled before picking up the rose. Gently tickling the end of her nose, he recalled the incident from years ago when the tables had been turned. He counted on the fact that Roxanne would remember it too. Roxanne twitched her nose, but she didn't wake up. Frankie laughed softly. Frank gave Frankie a finger-at-the-mouth gesture, urging him to keep quiet. After a moment, he tickled the bridge of her nose. She rubbed her nose, but still she didn't wake up. Frankie giggled. "Mommy's funny." Roxanne felt a feather-light touch tickling her nose. Frank's faint laughter invaded her senses, waking her. She shook her head and opened her eyes to the shocking sight of Frank sitting on the edge of her bed, holding a yellow rose. Her thoughts traveled back to the morning after their first time. But that was a different world. For one thing, Frank loved her back then. She didn't think he was capable of loving her anymore. And what's Frank doing here anyway? Then she remembered. Reality overshadowed her shock and confusion in a horrid display of fear. Roxanne wasn't prepared to see little Frankie standing behind his father, and she tried to smile for his sake. "Hi, Mommy." Frankie giggled and waved. "Come here." She motioned him to her side and moved over to give him room to climb onto the bed. "There's something we want to talk to you about." She looked at Frank. This was going to be a tough conversation, and she needed his help. Frank nodded as if reading her thoughts, and sat down on the bed beside Frankie. "What's wrong, Mommy?" Frankie asked, as if he sensed her turmoil. "Sweetie, your Aunt Candy's been in an accident," Roxanne said, weaker than she'd anticipated. "Huh?" Frankie didn't hide his confusion. Roxanne combed her fingers through his jet-black locks, brushing them back from his face. "Aunt Candy was driving in her car last night, and she got in a wreck on the freeway." Frankie's eyes grew wide. He knew what a car wreck was. He'd seen it on TV. "Will she be okay?" he asked, afraid. He didn't quite understand his fear, yet he knew it was there. "Of course she's going to be okay." Frank spoke up. "Is she in the hospital?" Frankie asked. "Yes, she is," Roxanne said. "You know what hospitals are for, don't you?" Frank asked, but didn't wait for the boy to reply. "Sometimes, when we get sick or we get into a car wreck, we go to the hospital, and the doctors make us all better. After a while, we get to come home. Good as new." "Can I go see her?" Frankie asked, hope filling his baby blues. "Well..." Roxanne's voice trailed off. She didn't want Frankie to see Candy in her present unconscious state and with all those bandages. "See, buddy," Frank stepped in, and Roxanne was grateful. "Aunt Candy needs to rest to get better, so she can come home. If you go see her, then she'll want to get up to play with you," he said, gently shaking his head. "But she's not well enough to do that yet." "Oh," Frankie said softly, and his expression of hope turned to one of sadness. "But I'll tell you what," Frank bargained with him. "How about you and I go down to the florist's, and we'll send Aunt Candy some flowers, just from you?" Frankie appeared to think about it a few seconds before his eyes lit up and a smile brightened his face. "Can I write my name on the card?" he asked, as if he knew all about sending flowers. "You can write your name?" Frank was impressed that he was even thinking about it. "Uh-huh," Frankie nodded. "Mommy taught me how to write my name," he said proudly, and then proceeded to spell it out. Frankie. Frank looked at Roxanne. At that moment, he felt admiration for her, but he couldn't allow it to last. In his eyes, what she'd done to him was inexcusable. Frank couldn't let go of the fact that Roxanne had not only hidden their son from him, but she'd also let another man publicly claim to be his father. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get past that. Still, he was thankful she'd been a good mother to his son. But no amount of good parenting would change his mind. He could have been a decent father, if she'd given him a chance. Frank and Roxanne slipped quietly into Candy's room and found Rich slumped over her bed. "Rich?" Roxanne shook him gently. "Rich, wake up." "Huh?" He sprang up and looked around. "You okay?" Frank asked. "Yeah." Rich rubbed his eyes with one hand. She woke up briefly last night." "She talked to you?" Roxanne asked, anxious. "Yes, she knew I was here," he said. "But she didn't really grasp the fact that she's in the hospital." "But she was talking to you, and that's good." Roxanne's gaze traveled from Rich to Frank. "Right?" "Candy's going to be fine," Frank said. "She's the only person in this world who thinks they can go a couple of rounds with me." His laughter spilled through the air. "Anybody who's got that much balls won't let a little thing like a car wreck get them down." "Frank Garrett," Candy muttered. "I'm gonna kick your ass." "Candy, stay with me." Rich latched onto her hand. "Okay, baby?" "Okay." Her voice was soft and tired. "Where's Rocky?" "I'm here," Roxanne said. "We're all here." "What happened?" Candy asked. "Why are my eyes covered?" "You were in an accident yesterday." Rich's words were tainted with guilt. "After you left my place." Vaguely, Candy recalled how upset she'd been after leaving his place. "Did I hurt anybody?" "Just you," he said. "Yours was the only car involved." "Rich has been here all night," Roxanne said. "He hasn't left your side for a minute." "Then he must be tired," Candy said. "And really hungry." "I'm fine." His voice broke, like he was near tears. "What's important now is you." Candy moaned. "I've got such a headache." She paused. Thinking took effort. "You should probably eat something," she said to Rich and then stopped again. Breathing hurt. "Rocky, would you take Rich and feed him?" "We don't want to leave you alone right now," Roxanne objected. "I won't be alone." Candy thought the clouds might be clearing. "Frank'll stay here with me. Won't you, Frankie?" "Of course I will," Frank said. Roxanne looked at Frank and gave him one of those "what do I do" looks. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'll be here with her. Just do what she wants." Rich and Roxanne left the room practically at a snail's pace, and Frank sat down in the chair beside Candy's bed. "I'm very sorry that this happened to you." "How is Frankie doing?" "He's fine. He misses you." "Tell him I'll be home soon." "He's anxiously awaiting your homecoming." Frank leaned back in the chair and folded his arms over his chest. "How is Rocky doing?" Candy asked. "I mean, really." "I don't want you to worry about Roxanne. I'm taking good care of her." "She needs you, you know." "You think?" He tried to tamp down the skepticism invading his tone. "You have no idea," Candy said with a hopeless laugh. "We don't want you worrying about such things. You just concentrate on getting better." Yeah. She tried to laugh it off. If she couldn't pin Frank down to any specifics right now, she never would. "Frank, am I going to be okay?" "Candy, you're gonna be fine." "My face," she hesitated. Did she want to hear the truth? depends on the answer. Not knowing had its bad points, like being left in limbo. Is my face disfigured? He was silent for a few seconds, and that bothered her. Well, he said, I haven't seen your face behind those bandages. Skillfully, he tap-danced around it. They did say you have some facial lacerations. His words were like swords' points. But you're going to be as good as new in no time. So don't you worry. He sounded confident, but she couldn't be sure who exactly he was trying to convince, himself or her. Facial lacerations. Nasty, ugly images slipped into Candy's mind. Oh, God. How badly was she disfigured? Candy, I assume you wanted me to stay because you knew I'd tell you the truth. His words said it was a question, but his tone suggested otherwise. At any rate, it yanked her back to reality. That is true. Then don't do this to yourself. His voice turned hard. You don't know the extent of the damage. It may amount to nothing, really. And it may not. Well, then your face can be restored. He laid it on the line. But that punctured lung could have easily killed you, and neither your sister nor my best friend could have handled that. Candy didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to think. Was she not allowed a little self-pity here? After all, she was an actress with a disfigured face. He, of all people, should understand. Singing was what he did, just like acting was what she did. If he lost his voice, just like she'd lost her looks, then where would that leave him? Still, getting down in the gutter with her misery, prematurely, wasn't productive. Frank was right. Why go there before she had all the facts? After another moment's pause, she said out loud, Thank you. You're welcome, he said. Although I'm not sure for what. You told me the truth, and you wouldn't let me lay here feeling sorry for myself. That evening, it took outstanding persuasion from Candy before Roxanne would consider the idea of going home. If you don't go home, Candy prepared to pull out the big guns. Frankie is going to start thinking something is terribly wrong with his Aunt Candy. And we don't want that, now do we? Roxanne couldn't argue with that one, so without further argument, she left the hospital with Frank. Sending Roxanne home with Frank wasn't the best of ideas, but there wasn't much Candy could do about it right now. She had her own point of issue with Rich. Of course, Rich was now saying that he'd accepted what he was feeling for Candy, that he loved her and he always had. Nothing like a trauma to make you see the light. But Candy knew better. Clearly, Rich was feeling nothing more than a case of pity, and the last thing she wanted from anyone was pity. She tried to tell him not to worry, that she understood. He didn't love her anymore, and that was okay, but he wasn't listening. Instead, he was vowing to take care of her. Why couldn't he understand? Candy wanted him to love her. She didn't want to be his charity case. Chapter 18. With Frankie tucked safely into bed, Frank and Roxanne settled onto the couch to watch some television. I know you're more worried about Candy than you're letting on, he said. I would think that's understandable. It is. But I'm here for you. You can lean on me if you need to. Frankie, I couldn't get through this without you. I'm not denying that. She shook her head. But I have to deal with what's happened to Candy the best way I know how. Frank was expecting Roxanne to cling to him, which is what she would have done in the past. And while she may need him to be there with her, she was no longer that girl from such a long time ago. These days, she dealt with her problems silently. It didn't do her any good to talk about the things that bothered her because no one ever understood why she felt the way she did. The doorbell rang. Are you expecting someone? He asked. No. I'll get it. He jumped up and disappeared around the corner. Soon he returned with a florist's box. Looks like somebody sent you some flowers. He presented the box to her with a smile. She was slow to take it, considering the implication. Could these possibly be from Frank? Why would he send her flowers? She looked at him, her attention drawn instantly to his sunglasses. She wished she could see into his eyes. Why won't you take those things off? Roxanne took the card off the box and read it quietly to herself. Dear Roxy, the roses are an effort to assure you that we can work this out if we try. And please believe me when I say that I'm more than willing to try. I'll love you forever. Frank. Roxanne hesitated, waiting for the catch. Removing the lid released the wonderful aroma of a dozen pale orange roses. In their midst lay a single yellow rose. She knew why it was there. He wanted her to remember. She just wasn't sure why. Those words he'd written on the card. I'll love you forever. How could that possibly be after what she'd done to him? Roxanne's gaze traveled back to Frank again. She wanted to believe it. Thank you, she said with cynical hope. Sometime later, after Frank had put Roxanne to bed, he patted himself on the back, convinced that he could have her any time he wanted. Hell, he could have her right now. She may not be ready to admit it, but that's what she wanted. Still, you can't always get what you want. This would be no exception for Roxanne. Frank knew what she wanted, and he had no intention of giving it to her. At least not right now. Good things come to those who wait. Or maybe it was deserved things. Either way, she'd like what she got when she finally did get it. And she'd be quite deserving of it, too. Frank told himself he wouldn't sleep with her because it was part of his plan. Certainly not because he didn't want to take advantage of her in her vulnerable state. Well, that's what he tried to tell himself. Once she'd fallen asleep, he took his briefcase and headed downstairs. With the seeds of a new song dancing around his mind, he headed for Roxanne's piano. Working all through the night and on into the next morning, he labored diligently. Soon enough, time would come to record a new album, and Frank had to get busy. Maybe seeing Roxanne again after all this time was actually a blessing. Because of his run-in with her, new and different words were coming to him every day. After the last album, he'd thought he'd exhausted that source within himself. But now he knew it wasn't true. Much more music still lived inside of him, aching for release. Frank didn't know any other way to express his feelings. Music was the only way he'd ever been able to constructively let it out. A few songs had done more damage than good, but it could have been much worse. In the early hours of the morning, just after daybreak, Roxanne heard the piano as she made her way downstairs. Frank's voice filled the air with a tune she couldn't recall. She found it hypnotic, but she couldn't be sure if it was his words or his singing. Letting go was so hard, you see. Life without you has been painful for me. Memories cloud my mind, of the love we had. Do you ever think of us? Does it ever make you sad? Well, I think about us every day. I think about us all too much, and I know I need to find some other way, 'cause I miss your sweet touch. I tried to find someone to take your place, but I never had any luck. Girl, I need you here by my side too, 'cause no one else will ever do. All those lonely nights were so hard to face, and I tried so hard to find someone else, someone to take your place. Well, I think about us every day. I think about us all too much, and I know I need to find some other way, 'cause I miss your sweet touch. I tried to find someone to take your place, but I never had any luck. I need to know that you still care, that you still need the kind of love that we share. I'm blinded by your charms. Is it really so bad to want to begin again? Because only in your arms can my broken heart mend. Well, I think about us every day. I think about us all too much, and I know I need to find some other way, 'cause I miss your sweet touch. I tried to find someone to take your place, but I never had any luck. Roxanne stood silently behind Frank, who seemed to be one with the piano as he brought the last few lines of the song to life. His sunglasses sat on top of the musical instrument. At first thought, she wanted to grab them and toss them in the trash. If she could see into Frank's eyes when he talked to her, then she'd also see what he was thinking. His eyes didn't lie, no matter how many half-truths and fallacies came out of his mouth. Frank must have sensed her presence because he stopped singing and playing abruptly. He glanced over his shoulder and smiled. What do you think? It's very pretty. Roxanne moved closer and rested her hand on the edge of the piano. I don't think anyone's ever played this piano until today, she said, a little on the nervous side. Roxanne's eyes glittered with a wild, trapped look. That's when Frank realized his sunglasses were off. He snatched up the Varnays and covered the mirrors to his soul. No matter how much he might want to, he couldn't let his feelings get in the way. Above all else, he had to protect himself from Roxanne. He wouldn't allow her another chance to hurt him. No matter what his songs cried out for, he refused to give her the opportunity to harm him again. This time it just might destroy him. Frank couldn't forget his main objective. Roxanne had to pay for what she'd done to him. Nothing else mattered. Sometimes Frank nearly lost sight of his goals. Luckily, though, something always reminded him that he had but one purpose in life. He might get a little carried away now and then, and he might secretly wish for something totally unattainable, but he always remained in control. That control kept him within the bounds of reality now. Ultimately, only one thing mattered. Roxanne Simon had to regret the day she met Frank Garrett. He knew better than anybody about that old saying regarding flies and honey. If he was sweet enough, he'd catch Roxanne with little effort. Then Frank remembered what had brought him to Roxanne's house in the first place. Candy. He supposed he should adhere to the matter at hand. After all, good things come to those who wait. And he could wait until Candy came home. By then he'd have a plan. One that detailed his plot for revenge against Roxanne. He picked out a short, sweet tune on the piano and then slapped his hands against his thighs. You ready to go to the hospital? If it's not a bother. You do seem rather busy. Rome wasn't built in a day, he said, standing. Taking the sheet music, he put it away neatly and protectively inside his briefcase. Some things are more important. He closed the lid. This can wait, he said, patting the top of the briefcase. Roxanne and Frank headed for the hospital, while Frankie stayed home with Rose. The doctor peeled the bandages away from Candy's face, and Roxanne clung to Frank. Because of the implications, he couldn't do anything but hold her and try to offer her comfort. The lacerations are healing nicely. The doctor's words were reassuring, but didn't seem to be directed at anyone in particular. I don't think there'll be a need for reconstruction after all. Does that mean my face isn't mangled? Candy asked with a hint of absurdity. That's right. This time the doctor's words were directed at Candy. When we remove the pads, you'll experience some fuzzy vision because your eyes have been covered for a few days. She peeled away the first pad. It shouldn't last long. Candy opened her eyes, thinking she was mentally prepared for the fuzzy vision. She could see brightness to the left. The window must be over there. There were shadows here and there, but she didn't have any idea where the doctor, nurse, or anybody else might be standing in the room. Somehow, Candy didn't think this was what the doc meant when she said fuzzy vision, because she couldn't see a damn thing. Candy got scared. The fact that Candy could only see shadows and a bit of light wasn't considered as having any sight at all. She found herself being subjected to more and more tests. At the conclusion of all those tests, the doctors found they didn't know anything more than they did when they'd started. Technically, there wasn't anything wrong with Candy. Medically speaking, her vision should be close to perfect. She shouldn't have a need for glasses, much less a blind person's cane. Candy sat there in her hospital bed, trying desperately to look around and see something. Anything. But it was no use. She couldn't see a damned thing. Hearing the soft knock at the door, she could guess her visitor's identity. "Rich?" she called out warmly. "There's no sneaking up on you, is there?" He gave her a sweet kiss on the cheek. "They're going to let me out of here this afternoon," she said. "Need a ride?" "I guess I do. I don't have a car anymore." She sighed heavily. "Even if I did, I can't see to drive." "Candy, I have to tell you something." No, you don't." "Yes, I do. And it won't do any good for you to say you don't want to hear it." He wanted her to understand his intentions. "If I would have admitted this in the first place, then we wouldn't be here in this hospital room right now. If it wasn't for my stupid pride." With each word, his voice powered up a notch. "I would have just come right out and told you a long time ago that I do love you," he said. "I always have, and I always will." One thing Candy understood was pride. She had more than her share of it, too. It had always been of the utmost importance to her. The way she saw it, if she lost her pride, then she was bound to fall. "Rich, we don't have to play this game anymore. I know how you feel. You made that quite clear the other day," she said. "I've accepted the fact that we can never be anything more than friends. So let it go." Candy underestimated Rich if she thought he'd back off so easily. As far as he could see, he had all the time in the world. If that's how long it took, he'd wait patiently. He'd found his calling, and it really didn't matter if she liked it or not. Roxanne stayed with Frank in the hospital lobby, and they waited for Rich to bring Candy down. Her heart and her conscience were heavily burdened by Candy's prognosis. "Since Rich is giving Candy a ride, do you want me to take you home?" Frank searched her face, as if he was on the trail of some buried secret. "You know where I'd really like to go?" Even as she said it, she wasn't sure why she had. Sure, she wanted to go there, but with Frank. Frank grabbed her hand and tugged her toward the parking garage exit, as if he knew exactly where she was talking about. Why did that surprise her? The drive to Sunset Beach remained mostly quiet between Frank and Roxanne. "It looks like rain," he said, looking at the sky filled with unbroken gray clouds. Rain was inevitable. But it couldn't stop the unavoidable. Win or lose, it was now or never. Coasting into a parking space in a mostly deserted lot, Frank killed the engine and stepped outside into a light drizzling rain. "You still want to stay?" he asked, opening her car door. She nodded. A little rain wouldn't scare her away. She needed the comfort the sight of the ocean could bring. He helped her from the car and held onto her hand as they walked along the beach in silence. Breathing in the damp sea air, Roxanne looked out over the water. There was something a little unsettling in the way those tiny raindrops fell from the sky and created such a disturbance over the bay. The rain fell harder, darkening the sand in spots. She didn't care that she was getting wet, and he didn't seem to mind either. They kept strolling along the water's edge, away from the populated area, toward a cluster of trees and seclusion. "I guess you won't be needing me anymore," he said with a hint of anxiety twisting his voice. "Frankie." Roxanne knew how much she needed him, but she didn't know how to make him believe it, or care. "Don't worry. I'm not going to push myself on you." His words were promising, but his tone was remorseful. "I know I'm not what you want. I just want to be able to see our son. When life is uncertain and the world is cold outside. I won't try to keep you and Frankie apart. Roxanne stopped and turned to Frank, wishing she could look into his eyes. Even though she couldn't see past his sunglasses, she tried to imagine what those baby blues of his might be hiding. I know you don't believe this, she shook her head. But I love you. No, he didn't believe it. But why couldn't it be so? He'd always loved her. He might not be willing to say it out loud, but that didn't mean it wasn't so. I know I don't have any right to be asking this of you, but I need you. I need to be with you. She paused with a small catch of breath. I know you don't like me very much anymore, but I have never, not once, ever stopped loving you. Frank smiled. He'd won. Reclaiming her lips, he crushed her to him. His mouth throbbed with a passion that had been lying dormant inside him for the last 5 years. He was shocked at the effect the kiss had on him. It was hard to control himself. He hadn't planned on this. He had won the battle, but his plans would have to change if he intended to win the war. Besides, it wouldn't be so bad. He'd always enjoyed making love to Roxanne. He cupped her face in his hands. You know that I've always loved you, he said, only because he knew it was what she wanted to hear. The fact that it could be true was beside the point. It ran so much deeper than that. He supposed, deep down, he'd have to admit that he did love her. But he wanted to hate her more than he needed to love her. He wanted her to pay for the betrayal. But mostly, she had to pay for keeping his son away from him. Glancing up and down the beach, he realized they'd walked so far that there were no houses or buildings in sight. And because of the rain, he doubted anyone would happen upon them. Frank slid his hands under her skirt and they fell easily together, dropping down to the wet sand. He rolled on top of her and showered her with ardent kisses. She welcomed his demanding kisses because she needed him so badly. She wanted Frank to make love to her. She needed to feel him inside of her. She'd made love with only 2 other men since disappearing all those years ago. In the end, she'd wanted nothing more than for both of those men to be Frank. Right now, she could have the real thing. She knew her aspirations were wrong, but she didn't care. She knew Frank Garrett would be her downfall sooner or later. She just didn't know if she needed to protect herself from him more than she needed to be with him. Make love to me, Frankie, she whispered, giving way to desire. Frank pushed his way inside her, feeling her urgency grabbing at him. This made his own passion grow with even more excitement. They made love, there on the beach, in the rain. And it's not that he didn't enjoy it, because he did. It's just that he had more reasons for doing it than passion's sake. Even so, he'd derived more satisfaction from the experience than he'd willingly admit, even to himself. Inside his mind, a plan came to him. If he married Roxanne, he could talk her into giving him legal rights to his son. Once that happened, he'd find a way to take Frankie away from her. Completely. The rain subsided as she settled into Frank's cozy embrace, exhausted. Roxanne thought she'd never be able to feel these things with Frank again. Still, in all her indulgence, she could only perceive the lie disguised so well as desire. It was a good lie, as far as lies go. But it was still a lie. Deep down inside, she knew Frank was out to get her. And worse yet, she couldn't do anything to stop him. I could let you back in, if it wasn't for my foolish pride. If I gave you the chance, would you take my heart for another ride? But now that you've come back to me, it's so plain to see. Even here in the rain, things still remain the same. They walked hand in hand back to his car. and Roxanne glanced at the ocean. The raindrops had ceased disturbing the water, and she felt a little better about things now. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't going to go quite as easy as it currently seemed. Chapter 19. Within a week, the Rogers family, who lived next door to Roxanne and Candy, sold out to the eccentric rock star Rich Hollander. He'd made them an offer that was too good to refuse, including covering the expense to move to their new home. He had also supervised their progress because the faster they moved out, the sooner he could move in. If Rich lived next door to Candy, it'd be a lot easier for him to look after her. Chapter 20. Little Frankie had been waiting eagerly for Roxanne's return. She'd gone to the pharmacy, and in all his excitement, she put the prescription bag on the table in the foyer and went into the living room to talk to him. "Mommy, when is Daddy coming back home?" Frankie looked at Roxanne with hauntingly familiar eyes. That was a scary thought. One that she'd wager had found its way onto her face in the form of a puzzling expression. "He stayed with us while Aunt Candy was in the hospital," he said. "Why isn't he here now?" "Do you want me to ask him if he wants to stay with us for good now?" Frankie nodded. Sure, that'd please little Frankie, but it scared the crap out of Roxanne. Frank entered Roxanne's house and, passing through the foyer, he noticed the pharmacy bag on the table. He picked it up, out of curiosity more than anything else. Then he saw Roxanne's name on the label. This piqued his interest. He opened the bag and shook the prescription bottles into his hand. Thorazine, Elavil, and Valium. He knew what Valium was, and he could make a pretty good guess about the other two. He'd been through this before with Roxanne. He'd put a stop to it then, and he was going to put a stop to it now. Racing up the stairs, he bellowed out her name and rushed into her bedroom. She was in her study, located down the hall. Hearing his powerful "I'm in charge" voice made her nervous. She hurried down the hall to her bedroom and stopped at her bathroom doorway. "Frankie? What's the matter?" Frank was rummaging through the medicine cabinet, snapping lids off her near-empty pill bottles and dumping the contents in the toilet. She watched anxiously as he flushed her meds down the drain. "What'd you do that for?" she asked in a troubled tone. "Roxy, you don't need that stuff," he said. "All you need in this world is me." Maybe so, but reality was a different affair. Without the medication, reality was whatever Roxanne's mind decided it was going to be at any given moment. Frank hadn't been there when she had no concept of reality whatsoever. He hadn't been there to witness the way she lost touch with reality, succumbing to all her delusions of grandeur and the sharply defined moods of depression, or the way she'd become suspicious of, and indifferent to, everyone around her. He hadn't been there when she couldn't distinguish New York City from Florida, or separate the past from the present. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Remember, I helped you through this before. I'll help you through it again." Softly, she let the words escape. "You don't understand." And neither did she. Not when her thoughts got jumbled up. Like now. Trounced by extreme fright, she wasn't sure if she could remember what to do. Jerry. That's it. She'd call Jerry. He would help her. He'd know what to do. Roxanne headed back to her study, closed the door, and locked herself inside. She sat down at her desk, picked up the telephone, and dialed the number to Jerry's private line. Confidence washed over her, knowing Jerry would fix everything. He always had. No reason to think he wouldn't now. "Yes?" Jerry's voice poured across the wire. "Jerry?" she whispered. "It's me, Roxanne." "What's up?" he asked. "Why are you whispering?" "Frankie." He had no idea which Frankie she was talking about, but that was nothing new. She'd referred to Frank as Frankie more often than not for as long as Jerry had known her. "He flushed my meds down the toilet," she said. "I'll be right there." "I'll wait in my study," she continued to whisper. "And I'm not coming out until you get here." It was becoming painfully clear to Jerry that Frank Garrett was going to make a nuisance of himself. He'd more than likely interfere with any recovery Roxanne could sustain at this time. What Jerry really needed was a way to get rid of him. Frank hovered behind Jameson like a wildcat guarding his prey as the man answered the ringing doorbell. "Good afternoon, Dr. Sterling." Jameson's casual greeting told Frank this man had been there before. "Roxanne is expecting me." Jerry ignored Frank as he passed through the foyer and headed toward the stairs. "Wait a minute." Frank followed him. "She doesn't need a doctor. She's not sick." Jerry stopped at the bottom of the stairs and turned to Frank. "First of all, I'm not that kind of doctor. Secondly, Roxanne is my patient, and I would thank you not to interfere." Saying what he had to say, Jerry headed up the stairs. "What the hell kind of doctor are you, then?" Frank chased after Jerry. Jerry stopped again, halfway up the stairs this time. Glancing over his shoulder, he glared at Frank in a less than friendly manner. "If it's any of your business, I'm a psychiatrist," he said, annoyed. "She doesn't need a shrink." Jerry bit back his temper. "Let me tell you something about Roxanne Simon. I've been treating her for more than 5 years. She suffers from a mental disorder called manic depressive psychosis." Jerry's patience was waning. He really had to get rid of this guy. "Now, whether you choose to trust my professional judgment or not is neither here nor there." Frank laughed. Some fruitcake shrink was trying to tell him that Roxanne was crazy. He refused to believe that. "She's not crazy." "She has a problem," Jerry said. "And for the life of me, I can't figure out why, but you seem to be the root of that problem." Jerry shook his head. "If you don't back off and let me do my job, you are going to kill her." Jerry turned around and started up the stairs again. This time he was determined not to stop. Frank didn't move from his spot on the stairs. "She's not crazy," he insisted in a low voice. "You, on the other hand, are quite insane. But she is not crazy." Jerry didn't stop until he got to Roxanne's study. He glanced over his shoulder to make sure Frank hadn't followed him up, then tapped lightly on the door. "Roxanne," he called out softly. "It's Jerry." The door opened, but only far enough for her to reach out and pull him inside. She looked flushed and drained of all her self-worth. "Is he out there still?" she asked in a soft whisper. "Yes," Jerry said in his normal tone. "Roxanne." He hesitated, but not for much more than a second or two. "If he upsets you so, why don't you just tell him to leave?" "I can't do that," she answered, definite. "Frankie needs his father." "When was the last time you had your medication?" "Couple hours ago." "Have you been taking it at regular intervals?" "Yes," she nodded. Jerry sat down on the corner of her desk. "Roxanne, I'm going to change your medication." She glanced at him anxiously. "Don't worry. I'm going to give you something that'll help you cope a little better." And if he hoped to do that, he'd have to exchange the Elavil for a small dose of Lithane. Even though he was worried about Roxanne taking the drug, the Elavil was no match for Frank Garrett. "I'm going to give you something that you've never taken before, but you've got to promise me you'll be careful with it." He hesitated. Roxanne usually heeded his direction, but still, a bad feeling washed over him on this one. "Take it only as I prescribe it." "What is it?" "Lithane. It's a lithium derivative. That didn't mean a whole lot to Roxanne, but she trusted his judgment. Hell, Jerry was the only man on Earth that she did trust. Well, except for maybe Jason. But she didn't trust Frank. At all. "Can you talk to him for me?" "Yes. I promise. Frank won't take your pills again." Roxanne sighed. She knew Jerry would keep his word. He gave her a sedative and sent her to her bedroom, saying she'd fall asleep soon. He promised he'd see to it that Frank left her and her meds alone. Knowing that she'd get some rest now, Jerry headed downstairs to look for Frank. In his opinion, the best thing that could happen to Roxanne would be for Frank Garrett to fall off the face of the earth. For some ungodly reason, she thought she needed him. Jerry worried that taking away what she thought she needed could do more damage than trying to protect her from it. Finding Frank and little Frankie in the living room watching television, Jerry turned his attention to the boy. "Hello, Frankie. I think your mom needs a hug. So why don't you go on upstairs and give her one?" he said calmly. "Okay, Dr. Jerry." Frankie hopped down off the couch and left the room. Jerry waited until Frankie had disappeared upstairs, and then said, "I'm going to phone the pharmacy with new prescriptions for Roxanne. I want you to go pick them up right away." Frank shook his head, readying for an objection. Jerry gave him a stern look. "If you choose to withhold her medication again," he turned his tone sharp and professional, "or if you try to interfere with her treatment in any way, you'll leave me no choice but to commit her, so she can get the proper care she needs." Committed, Frank thought. What a novel idea. But not this way. Not now, not before he married her. And certainly not before she signed the papers confirming him as Frankie's legal and biological father. There couldn't be any maybes here. He didn't want to have to fight any court battles, especially with Candy. Right now, Frank had to do his part to keep Roxanne sane. For the moment, anyway. At least until they were married and she signed the papers. Then and only then, if what Jerry had told him was true, attaining his goal would be easier than ever. "I want what's best for Roxanne," Frank said, as if he really meant it. "But I just can't help but wonder." "What?" "If what you say is true, was it wise to send Frankie up there to be with her?" "Roxanne is no threat or danger to her son," Jerry said. "Fact is, he seems to be her only link to reality, and the only time she's truly okay is when she's with him." "Well, I guess I have to trust your judgment." "Can I ask you a personal question?" Jerry asked, but didn't wait for a reply. "What exactly are your intentions toward Roxanne?" Frank resented that. "If it's any of your business, I intend to marry her. Which is something I should have been given the opportunity to do a long time ago." Frank had a point there, one that even that fruitcake shrink would have a hard time arguing. Frank didn't know if he could buy all this psychotic nonsense. Sure, she'd done some pretty stupid things in her time, but he didn't think the reason could be labeled as crazy. Still, he couldn't take the chance of refusing to believe it. He had to make certain she stayed sane long enough for him to accomplish his objective. After that, he didn't give a damn what happened to her. If she really was nuts, it would make his job a whole lot easier. But until that time came, he had to play the role of the concerned husband-to-be. Chapter 21. Roxanne's home sat on the south shore of Lake Ellen. Homes with private docks lined the south, east, and west shores, while the north shore housed an elite country club. Roxanne's home sat near the center of the south shore. 2 walls of windows lined her study located on the second floor of the western corner. On a clear day, she could see the entire lake and its surrounding areas. Sometimes she'd just sit and stare out the window, taking in the goings-on around the lake. Today there was nothing going on. The rain fell steadily while she tried to work on her new book, but her attention kept slipping back to the scene outside. With her elbow propped on the desk, she rested her chin in the palm of her hand. She gazed across the lake toward the golf course. Naturally, it was deserted today. The golfers probably had to resort to work due to the rain. The lake was empty, too. Usually there were 3 or 4 boats out there and some pulled water skiers behind them. But not today. Nothing was going on out there today. No one on the golf course, no one on the docks, and no one in their boats on the lake. The desolate scene left Roxanne with a lonely feeling. A sudden chill of lonesomeness rushed over her, and she thought about Frank. She'd always loved him so much, but she'd also hurt him. Although she believed he'd forgiven her, she had to wonder why he'd done it so easily. Deep down, she knew it was all wrong. She also knew she couldn't do anything about it. She needed to be with him. But more importantly, she needed to be fair to him for a change. The knock at the door brought her back to reality. Usually she knew in an instant the identity of the person on the other side of the door, but this time she had no idea who was out there. "Yes?" she called out, a little puzzled. The door crept open, and Frank walked in with a smile, obviously proud of himself for some reason. Yet he still wore those damned sunglasses. Roxanne tried to smile, wishing he'd take them off. He strolled across the room and stopped in front of her desk. "You know," he said, looking around, "you need a chair in here." "I have a chair in here," she said of the one she was sitting in. "I'd like to talk to you, but there's nowhere for me to sit." She rested her chin in the palm of her hand. "There's a chair out in the hallway." Frank's spirit never faltered as he headed for the hall and retrieved the chair. He brought it inside and placed it directly in front of her desk. Sitting down, he stuck his hands inside his jacket pockets. "What's up?" she asked, her chin still in her hand. "You know that I love you." "So you say." "Do you believe it?" He fiddled with the velvety soft box in his pocket. Roxanne didn't say anything right away. It was like she was thinking about it. "Yes," she finally said, but the look on her face suggested she didn't know why she believed it. Frank took the black jewelry box out of his pocket, opened it, and set it on the desk in front of her. "Will you marry me?" he asked with overwhelming confidence. The emerald-cut pink diamond shined with all its brilliancy against the black velvet. The 2.19-carat intense pink gem in its platinum setting took Roxanne's breath away. The diamond's natural color, a vivid hot pink, could be compared to a bright pink snapdragon or the fruit of a pomegranate. The geological process that colors a diamond pink remains a mystery, which is why Frank chose that particular color. He was well aware that anyone who saw it would never suspect that he had ulterior motives. Finally, her eyes sparkled with an odd light, but it was overshadowed by the smile tipping her mouth. She nodded before she said, "Yes." A few days later, on November 12th, Frank's birthday, he and Roxanne married in a simple ceremony. If he'd had his way, the small guest list would have been a lot smaller. While he was in favor of Rich, Frankie, Candy, and of course the band and Glenna being there, he wasn't happy about Jameson and Rose's presence as guests. They were servants, and he saw no reason for them being treated otherwise. He didn't see the point in Roxanne's publisher or her agent attending, and he wouldn't have invited that fruitcake shrink to come nosing around either. But they were her friends, and Frank had to agree to their presence to get what he wanted. He didn't have to like it, though. Once the ceremony was sealed with a kiss, the caterers served champagne and hors d'oeuvres. At Candy's request, Rich took her to Roxanne's side. "Can I get you girls anything?" he said, as if he knew Candy wanted to talk to Roxanne alone. "You can get us a joint." Roxanne's soft laughter pealed through the room. "One joint coming up. I'll send it over with Glenna." "Let's step out by the pool," Roxanne suggested, leading Candy outside. "How are you?" Candy asked, feeling for the table and chair as she sat down. "Fine." "Are you happy?" "Yes." Roxanne was glad Candy couldn't see her face, and she prayed the girl wouldn't sense anything different in her voice. "I've waited so long for this," Candy said, sadness invading her tone. "And now that it's happened, I can't see it. You will regain your sight, and when you do, you'll be happy to know there's a videotape." Roxanne wanted nothing more than to shift the conversation away from herself. "I might add that Rich looks incredibly handsome in his tux." Candy laughed softly but didn't say anything. Glenna slipped out onto the terrace and joined Roxanne and Candy. "A toast?" She waved the joint in the air before firing it up. "What are we toasting?" Roxanne giggled. "Besides the joint and us." "Us," Glenna nodded. "That's a good start, don't you think?" "Just like old times," Candy said softly. From inside the house, Frank watched them pass the joint around and listened as the air filled with their laughter. Watching them reminded him of the old days. But a lot of time had passed, and a great many things had happened since then. They were all wealthy, for one thing, and God knows a lot older. But watching the three of them right now, it seemed like the time and changes that had taken place had no meaning. They were acting the same as they always had. Definitely 3 peas in a pod. "Can we change the rules? Or are we just a couple of fools? Maybe the rain can wash all our troubles away and bring us hope again and the promise of a new day." Frank and Roxanne hadn't planned a honeymoon. Both had agreed they had too much work to do. Just to placate her, he suggested they postpone it until the band finished the new album. For the wedding night, he booked a suite on the shoreline of Sunset Beach. The word got out quickly once the newlyweds checked into the hotel, but that didn't bother Frank. He was counting on the press to do their part. Frank wanted the whole world to know Roxanne was his wife. He especially wanted Kirk Bronson and David Faulkner to know that. More than anybody else, he wanted them to know it. Nothing that happened to Roxanne during their 5-year separation had eluded Frank. He knew all about her affairs with her co-stars. First Kirk Bronson, then David Faulkner. Frank wanted them both to know she belonged to him. She always had, and this wedding proved it. But more importantly, he wanted the entire world to know that Frankie was his son. Frank made the casual suggestion that they go down to the beach, knowing how much Roxanne loved it, and watch the sunset and maybe the stars come out. He made no attempt to conceal their intentions, parading her through the hotel lobby on one arm and a blanket under the other. His intent was to make sure that all who noticed could easily guess their destination. If Frank turned out to be as lucky as he thought, then it shouldn't take the press much more than 20 minutes or so to swarm them. He spread the blanket over the sand and lay down on his side, propping his head in his hand. Roxanne sat down and leaned against his chest. There weren't too many people left on the beach now that the sun had slipped behind the horizon. The fact that the press wouldn't have to look too hard to find them pleased Frank. "Look." Roxanne pointed toward the sky. "The evening star." "You're right." "When I was little, I used to wish on the first star of the evening." "Did your wishes ever come true?" "Sometimes." She gave him an optimistic smile. "You going to make a wish now?" "I will if you will." "Do I have to tell you what it is?" No, she said quickly. You have to keep it a secret or it won't come true. Okay. He smiled to himself. Her optimism was infectious, but he had to remember why he was really here. They sat silently for a time, making their respective wishes. I wish, Roxanne thought, that we can be happy together. Frank savored the thought of a wish. There were lots of possibilities, but the one he favored best? I wish that she really is crazy. Confident that he'd made the best of all possible wishes, he said out loud, What did you wish for? I can't tell you that. It won't come true. I'll tell you mine, he said, if you'll tell me yours. Tell me yours first? All right. I wished that our love would last forever. Really? She said as if that surprised her. Really. He looked her straight in the eye. What'd you wish for? I wished we could be happy together. Yeah, like that's going to happen. Can I ask you a question? She asked, searching his face. Sure. Are you going to wear those things forever? What, the sunglasses? Frank knew why she wanted him to take them off, and that's exactly why he wouldn't. She'd seen inside his soul, and he refused to let that happen again. Roxanne, he paused, merely for effect. I do love you, he said with a twinge of honesty. I always have, and I always will. But that didn't change the fact that she had to be punished for what she'd done to him. She looked at the rings he'd placed on her finger and hesitated, eyes glued to the jewelry. She finally looked back at him with the beginnings of tears glistening her eyes. My heart is in your hands, she said. And I do love you. Frank heard chattering voices behind them, thankful for the interruption. He looked over his shoulder and saw the oncoming reporters. Finally. He jumped to his feet and extended his hand to Roxanne. Come on, he said, helping her up. It's the press. As the crowd approached, she clung tightly to Frank's hand and stood close to him as if he were her protector. Frank, someone yelled out. Is it true? Camera flashes lit up the night. Did you marry Roxanne today? Yes, he said coolly. That is true. Flashes continued to go off, and Frank realized the pictures would be plastered everywhere tomorrow, in every newspaper, tabloid, and magazine. He took Roxanne's face in his hands and kissed her sweetly. The photographers tried to capture a shot of the kiss. I love you, he whispered against her lips. This was the picture he hoped ended up in all the papers around the country. That increased the chances of Kirk Bronson and David Faulkner seeing it. What about your son, Roxanne? A reporter squeezed to the front of the crowd. How is he taking this? Once he came into view, Roxanne recognized him right away. It seemed over the years this guy had nothing better to do than follow her around wherever she went. Max, she gave him a dry, unfriendly greeting. Well, how about it? He challenged her. How is your son adjusting to having a stepfather? Roxanne didn't imagine that inquiry sat too well with Frank. I'd like to set the record straight, Frank said, proving her right. Roxanne's child. Frankie is my biological son. Max directed his curiosity at Roxanne. Is that true? Yes. Why did you let the whole world believe Kirk Bronson was his father? He was coming across a bit resentful. Understandable, since Kirk was the one who'd made that claim to Max all those years ago. Why, Max, she paused purely for effect. I was simply leading you on a wild goose chase. Well, Max. Frank relished in the opportunity to laugh at the reporter who'd broadcast the lie about Kirk Bronson being Frankie's father in the first place. Looks like the joke's on you. I was fooling myself. But was I fooling you? In the rain, I can see you standing there. In the rain, I can still believe that you care. Don't break my heart. Don't throw our love away. Frank had let the press serve their purpose. Now they could spread the news to the world that Roxanne belonged to him. So long as Kirk and David got that message, that's all Frank cared about. But now he had no more use for the press, so he cut their little get-together off abruptly. He simply grabbed the blanket, took Roxanne's hand, and walked away. A few of the reporters attempted to follow them, but Frank ignored them as he continued to lead Roxanne back inside the hotel. The elevator doors closed with them inside the compartment. Frank turned to Roxanne. "You're not mad, are you?" "Mad?" "That I kissed you in front of them and told them I'm Frankie's father?" Roxanne smiled and glanced away shyly. "Everyone should know you're Frankie's father. I intended to set the record straight in my new book. But you told them tonight, and that's fine with me." "Speaking of your new book," he paused long enough to capture her hand in his. "If you don't get busy working on it, and I don't hurry up and get into the studio," he raised her left hand into the air, "we may have to hawk your rings." Roxanne laughed softly and fell comfortably into Frank's arms. It had been a long time since he'd actually tried to make her laugh.